thing on? So just walk right in front of the camera, just don't hit the... Hey, so welcome to, I think, the 10th annual Constitution Day here at Boise State. We've been, the American Founding Initiative, which is run out of my coat pocket, is proud to sponsor it, and not only as part of America's federal mandate to all colleges to do something to celebrate the Constitution, but also because I think it's good in itself. And we've had some great speakers, and hopefully this year will be no exception. We'll talk about that afterward. Tonight's talk is on Reconstruction and Republicanism, and our speaker is Professor Forrest Nabors, who comes to us from the University of Alaska in Anchorage. He is a Jersey boy, you'll find out when he comes up, and is now kind of traveled west and lives there, but he traveled west as an undergraduate and went to Claremont, did graduate work at both Chicago and University of Oregon, and then through good fortune and talent, landed up in Alaska. He wrote a very fine book, recently published from the University of Missouri Press, entitled From Oligarchy to Republicanism, and on the story and goals of Reconstruction. It's one of the most unique and interesting books on a well-mined topic that is the Civil War that you'll run across probably in the last 20 years or so. And the talk he's giving tonight is somewhat of a spin-off from that book. But you didn't come here to hear Yenner, you came here to hear Professor Nabors, so let's bring him on up. Welcome, please, Professor Forrest Nabors.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you very much, Professor Yenner, for having me, and thank you all for coming out on Constitution, well, Constitution Day +1, and to deliver the Constitution Day lecture this year. If you don't mind, there seem to be a lot of students in the audience tonight. How many of you are not students, either members of the community or faculty? Okay, great. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for coming. I'm going to begin, I'm just going to jump right to it, and I decided I'm going to begin a little bit in different fashion than I had intended. I'm going to read the last couple paragraphs from my late book and on what is possible for our country if we renew our knowledge and understanding of our system of government. So here goes. Every generation in the free world needs an education in the history and principles of free government. A better educated public then and now would appreciate and defend Republican institutions, union, and federalism properly understood. They would be inoculated from error and deception. The stability of our institutions and the transformation of the merely legal union of citizens into an affectionate union are the natural fruits of instruction and the first principles of our government. Those principles teach us that none may be exalted above another or debased beneath another with justice, and they prepare us to fly to the defense of each other's rights when any of us are threatened. They teach us also that mankind ought to enjoy the rights that we enjoy, and that we ought to do what we can, when we can, to help them secure their rights. The American people deserve to know that their government was handed down to them by predecessors who were true to those principles when only courage could save them. When our forebears passed that government to us, still resting upon the claim of natural equality, they annihilated descent by blood and bone as a condition for membership in our common family of citizens. And they annihilated descent by blood and bone as a condition for claiming them as our common fathers. The American people deserve to know these facts in their history, which tell them who they really are. With this knowledge, they will be able to see each other in a more proper light and tighten their bonds of affection with each other, and thus united, reinstate their government's obedience to their Republican Declaration and Constitution, regain their moral confidence in themselves and in their nation, and reclaim their rightful mission in the world. Real national power, as James Wilson explained, is derived from moral causes. Recovery of our history and Republican mission will annex a new and greater power to our existing stores of power, which can serve the good of humanity, reaping new garlands for our people. To achieve these ends, we must know our history and the principles of our government better. The duty of the philosopher and the historian is to rise to this challenge and to meet this need. They can and should complete the great task begun by the fathers of the Republic and continued by the Republicans of Reconstruction by teaching our people their good works, which aimed above all to dedicate and rededicate the American nation to the cause of liberty. So at the end of this book, I'm appealing to education and saying and trying to make a case for what is possible if we make sure that we understand our Constitution, we understand what constitutional government is, and our Declaration of Independence. The subject of my talk tonight is on Article 4, Section 4 of the United States Constitution, known as the Guarantee Clause, which says that the United States shall guarantee to every state in this union a republican form of government. And this, in my view, is one of the most important and underappreciated clauses in the United States Constitution, because it's the only place in our Constitution that mentions a specific form of government anywhere. We today use the word democracy and its variant democratic as if the word democracy is an unqualified good, and anything that has the word democratic added to it, it's better. So if you're having steak for dinner, a democratic steak probably tastes better than just a plain steak, right? I mean, democratic, the word is an unqualified good in our lexicon, in our common lexicon. How did that happen? Why is it that our Constitution says that the United States, that the United States shall guarantee to every state every state in the union a Republican form of government? It doesn't say democracy. Well, the United States, when it was formed, it was always known to be a republic. That's the language that they use. And it was not really until the 20th century that the word, democracy was replaced republic as a way to describe our system of government and our nation. Right? It used to always be republic. And if you go through all of the inaugural addresses of all the presidents, I've done this, you will see that it's not until a very late date that the language changes. And the reason for this is that at a certain point in the life of our nation and of the political regime, we decided that we wanted a more democratic republicanism than that we had before. And so the word democratic republicanism was a mouthful. They dropped out the Republican and then they just said democracy. But in fact, as many of you who are studying political science know, a direct democracy is not what the founders had in mind, the direct democracy. So I want to go back to the meaning of this clause. Suffice it to say that when we use the word democracy today, we tend, in general, we are referring to the idea that the word Republican form of government alludes to. It's the idea of popular sovereignty. The idea that the people are the rulers, the ultimate rulers of this nation by natural right. So it's somewhat similar to common day, nomenclature today when we use the word democracy. So why was this clause in the Constitution? For an explanation, I give you James Iredell, who was in the Constitutional Convention, and then was in the ratifying convention in his home state of North Carolina, and this is what he says. The meaning of the guarantee provided was this: there being 13 governments confederated upon a republican principle, it was essential to the existence and harmony of the confederacy that each should be a republican government, and that no state should have a right to establish an aristocracy or monarchy. That clause was therefore inserted to prevent any state from establishing any government but a republican one. Every one must be convinced of the mischief that would ensue if any state had a right to change its government to a monarchy. If a monarchy was established in any one state, it would endeavor to subvert the freedom of the others and would probably by degrees succeed in it. That's the reason why the guarantee clause is there. It's to preserve that system of government uniformly across the entire Union. Now, why? Here's Madison and Federalist 39. Why should all of the states be a Republican? Why should they be uniformly a Republican? And he says in Federalist 39, this is Madison writing as Publius, governments of dissimilar principles and forms have been found less adapted to a federal coalition of any sort than those of a kindred nature, end quote. So, in other words, you can't really form a strong union if one state is ruled in oligarchic fashion and the other in republican fashion. They have to have the same regime type, or they will inevitably conflict. They won't be able to stay in the same kind of union or coalition for very long. They will, for certain, break apart. Now, so those are just some quotes from the Times to explain to you why it's there. Now let me tell you how constitutional law nowadays, constitutional law scholars, which influences the courts and jurisprudence about this clause, how they deal with it. And really the scholarship that dominates constitutional law scholarship on this particular clause is done by a guy named William Wiesek. I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly. He wrote a book on the guarantee clause in the 1970s. And this is what he says about it. Probably the word Republican was not meant to have any strictly definable significance. Few of the delegates in Philadelphia tried to explain precisely the concept of Republican government. The document they drafted abounds in vague words and phrases. Because the Constitution is so much the product of compromise, we run a danger of reading history backwards when we construe it, seeing meanings in words and phrases that would surprise the men who use them. An attempt to find conceptual precision in a document whose most important immediate virtue had to be its acceptability may be misleading. Thus, the word Republican may well not have had any single and any universal denotation to the men who inserted it into the guarantee clause. It may, in fact, have had no meaning at all. John Adams complained late in life that, quote, the word republic, as it is used, may signify anything, everything, or nothing, end quote. He insisted, this is Wiesek, again about to quote Adams, he insisted that he, quote, never understood, end quote, what the guarantee of Republican government meant. Quote, and I believe no man ever did or ever will, end quote. Okay, so what is the impression that this constitutional law scholar, who is so widely celebrated for his work on the guarantee clause, what is the implication here? Well, there's no meaning to this. And you can surmise what his purpose is in making this case when you reach the last chapter of this book. And he quotes another figure out of context, Charles Sumner, who says how powerful the guarantee clause is. Senator Charles Sumner, who lived during the Civil War Reconstruction period. And then it urges jurists to breathe into the word Republican what they want to breathe into it. In other words, if this is a potent clause, the United States government has the power, according to Iredell, to remediate states that may have deviated from the definition of Republican. And it has that power. It has the power like the law of the Roman dictator did in Republican Rome. You suspend normal, it gives permission for the federal government to suspend normal state-federal relations, to reach its arm into the offending state and fiddle with the government, okay? Directly. That's an awesome amount of power it gives, for good reason. Wiesek says that the word Republican here has no meaning, so jurists, therefore, are free to put the meaning in that they want to and then use that clause. Whose ends do you think he wants to advance here? Well, it's pretty clear which side of contemporary political struggles he's on. And so what he's trying to do is offer up a power, an untapped power, untapped power to folks in the government who would like to do things to the American political regime that have long and deep effects. So, but the bottom line, what I want to explain here is that he's wrong. And he's taking the founder, Adams isn't the only one he takes out of context in the beginning of this book, but he takes Adams out of, but just, I'm gonna stick with Adams to show you how ridiculously he takes Adams out of context. The entire life of John Adams was spent teaching his countrymen about Republican government and working for its establishment and greater success in North America. In 1776, Patrick Henry begged his friend John Adams to write the famous Thoughts on Government so that Southern statesmen who were sympathetic to Republican government would better understand it and could better establish it in their own states, because they were breaking from Great Britain, and Henry knew that the expert on Republican government was John Adams, and that its practice, at least in North America, had reached the highest state of perfection in Adams' New England. So, Thoughts on Government was written by John Adams, this famous pamphlet. It's famous to those who study the period, because these Southern statesmen were asking for instruction. In 1779, the Massachusetts Constitutional Convention that was set up to frame a constitution for the state of Massachusetts. This is after national independence, and the states have got to develop new state constitutions. In the order by the state convention, they assign the job of writing a constitution for a free republic to the selfsame John Adams. Now, if he had no idea what Republican government was, it's very strange that they would give him the job of writing a Republican constitution, or that Patrick Henry would ask him to write a pamphlet explaining Republican government to Southern statesmen. And then, to top it off, he wrote a multi-volume defense of the constitutions of the United States around this very same time, which critically reviews 38 republics, both ancient and modern in history, and critically reviewed 17 Republican writers. Adams did this. He authored this great work. So, was he really at a loss for defining Republican government as Wiesek says? In one of the quoted letters, one of the letters that Wiesek quotes, here's what Adams really wrote. Here's the context. Quote, "In some writing or other of mine, I happened, currente calamo," which is offhand, to drop the phrase, "The word republic, as it is used, may signify anything, everything, or nothing," end quote. Now, Adams did not say that he didn't know what a republic was, but that others were misusing the term, quote, signifying anything, everything, or nothing. In another letter, 1 month later, he writes, quote, "I have always been convinced that abuse of words has been the great instrument of sophistry and chicanery of party, faction, and division in society," end quote. And he singled out the word republic as one much abused word. He says that the customary meanings of the words republic, quote, "have been infinite and applied to every government under heaven, that of Turkey and that of Spain, as well as that of Athens and of Rome, of Geneva and San Marino," end quote. But this was the European error that he and the Americans criticized and had worked to correct in theory as well as in practice. And indeed, his defense of the constitutions of government of the United States of America attempts to instruct Americans in the reading world on the subject of natural rights republicanism and to distinguish that American version from prior versions. In that work and others, he writes prodigiously on Europeans' misuse of the words republic and republican. No doubt Adams did understand that there were many subtypes of republics, the variety depending upon their institutional structure, but the defining characteristic of a free republic then being established in America was its foundation upon natural rights. This is one of the two innovations that Madison says separated American statesmanship, Republican statesmanship from prior history. And he thought that they had, the Americans had so improved the science of government that lovers of Republican liberty and free government now had solutions to age-old problems, and the two key innovations, one of the two key innovations was the foundation of Republican government on natural right, natural right. In another letter quoted by Wiesek, this constitutional law scholar, Adams describes the development of the American governments after the moment of independence. Referring to himself and his fellow delegates to the Continental Congress, he said, quote, "We all acknowledged the right of the people to frame their own governments, and we knew they would not think of any other than Republican governments. The most of us, and myself among the rest, neither wished or thought of introducing any other, nor have I wished for any other to this moment," end quote. And then he says that's the moment when he remarks that he never understood what the guarantee clause meant, and that he did not believe that any man ever did or ever will. When he says that, he was complaining about the lack of specificity in the text of the guarantee clause. The well-intended drafters of the Constitution should have added more specificity, he thought, because the word republic, as he says, quote, "The word republic has been used, it is true, by learned men to signify every actual and every possible government among men, that of Constantinople as well as that of Geneva." In other words, Adams lamented others' erroneous usages of the word Republican and worried that the word in the guarantee clause would be subject to misinterpretation, or worse, deliberate politically motivated misinterpretation. So he wanted more specificity to protect the American meaning of the word Republican, including its grounding in natural right. And that was important to him, and so what he's trying to do is to protect he's trying to protect this American meaning. And Hamilton and Madison also distinguished the their American, their understanding of American republicanism and distinguish them from definitions advanced by Europeans. And you can see this in Hamilton's criticism of European authors in Federalist 14. You can see this in Federalist 39 by Madison. And then he defines it. Madison defines it in Federalist 39. And after saying that the Europeans have used this term with extreme inaccuracy, he then says that it's when power is deputed by the people and is exercised for their benefit. I'm paraphrasing here. But you find it at the very top of Federalist 39, again, in 1790 in the first Congress, when they are about to frame their first naturalization law. They're debating what requirements they should put on foreigners who want to become naturalized American citizens. And one of the congressmen says, well, let's have them swear an oath that they will uphold Republican government. And somebody in passing says, oh, what does that mean? You know, we can't do that because that could mean anything. Madison steps in and says, oh, that's not true at all. It means this. And he gives the same definition that he gives in Federalist 39 at that moment too. The Americans did have a fairly clear understanding of what their republicanism meant. Now, I want to talk about the circumstances of 1787 quickly and show you why this clause was so important to Americans in the early republic and why it fell into disuse later. So in 1787, remember the United States was only 11 years old, and it had been under monarchic rule. So many of its institutions are still influenced by the monarchy. And for those of you who study how political regimes work, it's impossible to expect any political regime or after a revolution to just successfully change overnight and be done with it. You can't go from monarchy to republicanism like that and expect to have a pure republic right away. Statesmen have to take the material that they have inherited and reshape it as best as they can into the form that they're aiming for, right? And all founders of new regimes have to do this. Lenin had to do this in the Soviet Union. Ayatollah Khomeini had to do this in Iran. Ataturk had to do this in Turkey. Go down the list to many different kinds of political regimes. And the Americans, they had that same challenge. Now, they were very, very fortunate that not only did they all agree that they wanted to break away from Great Britain, but also that there was a lot of agreement about what kind of government they wanted to establish, what kind of political regime they wanted to establish after they broke away from monarchic rule. That is unusual during revolutions. For example, during the French Revolution, many did agree they wanted to get rid of the monarchy, but they were terribly divided about what to put in its place. And then they started killing each other. The Americans never did that. North of South Carolina, they were, a majority of the American statesmen were agreed that they wanted to establish a Republican form of government. What was their biggest impediment to establishing Republican government? It was slavery. So I'm writing another book that's a follow-on to this one. The book that I've just published and that some of you have read is Volume 2 in a planned 3-volume series. Volume 1 is going to be on the founding. And what I'm arguing in the founding was that slavery was not only prescribed by the American founders north of South Carolina on moral grounds, but it was also as an institution. It was the most difficult barrier that they had to overcome in order to establish true sovereignty of the people, true Republican government. There are many, if you look through what these American statesmen say about slavery at the time, if they say anything meaningful about slavery, almost always they're attacking it. Again, north of South Carolina. They explain why. Now, I'm going to try to explain the differences in the sections because this becomes very, very important during the founding period. And I'll begin, there are three. New England, Mid-Atlantic, and then South Carolina and Georgia constitute one section. Scott, how am I doing on time? Thank you.
7:30.
Okay, so like I'm
You got
20 minutes. Okay, wonderful. Great. Sometimes I talk too much. I'm going to try to get this all out for you because this is very, very important. So I'll give you my argument in a nutshell. New England is the home of American Republicanism. That's where the ideas were planted, that's where they sprouted, that's where they took root. That's where that way of life in its earliest form reached its highest level of perfection. I've tried to understand why that is, and my best answer is that it comes from their unique version of Christianity. They believed in sola scriptura. They believed in that salvation is worked out between the individual and his or her God, and so they needed to all get literate as soon as they could possibly get literate. The first things that they built when they built new towns were churches and schools, so that they could, and the schools were there so that they could read the Bible, and these little kids were reading books before they could barely walk. And because they also understood that human beings are equal in the eyes of God, and from Galatians 3 it says there's neither Jew nor Greek nor man nor female nor bond nor free, but you are one in Jesus Christ. They really made that the basis of church government, which became the basis of their civil government. We all understand that John Locke is sort of silent, a shadow founder of the United States. That's not true. New Englanders in the General Court of Massachusetts were pressing arguments, basing those arguments on their natural rights in the decade that John Locke was born. John Locke was admired by Jefferson for sure, but those ideas and concepts that you see in Locke were already being worked out in New England long before he began writing. And they were organizing their communities around those ideas. And a lot of what we have been taught to believe by Puritan civilization, they're unfortunately mediated by Arthur Miller and other modern critics, is just wrong. They were a very literate people, and they read everything. John Adams describes the libraries of the founders of New England who came over. And they had, as he puts it, they had the best of ancient and modern learning with them, with their books. These were the people who ran themselves through the famous New England town halls. They developed them. It was their idea, as Jefferson later says, that all human beings have a fixed quanta of rights, and the New Englanders really lived by this, that
They were jealous of their own natural rights and respectful of the natural rights of others, and they were equal in the number and quantity of their rights as anybody else. This is why they could not bear tyranny of any sort. That is why, if you walk on the field of, if you go to Lexington and Concord, you see that these people were really incapable of backing down. They couldn't. I've been on Lexington Green where some 45 or 50 American Minutemen turned, or not Minutemen, but militiamen turned out and met it on marching 850 regular British troops bearing down on them there to take their arms away. And they weren't quite sure what to do. This was a surprise. And at first they were going to stand and fight, which would have been to the death. And then their commander, Captain Parker, told them to disband. While they were disbanding, they were shot in the back. So when the British march on to Concord, they run into, now their Americans militia are coming in from all sides, and they're there to meet them. And they don't break. The British fire, they stand their ground. Then they fire back, and the British break and run. They chase them all the way back to Boston. These are people who didn't know how to submit. As Jefferson says in his summary view of the rights of British America, he really might as well have been talking about New Englanders when he says that to bow and to bow and sue for grace on bended knee is not an American art. Right? They couldn't do that, and their own religious faith was behind this. Again, to repeat what Jefferson says about New Englanders, they were jealous of their own rights, respectful of the rights of others. See? And it didn't matter if they were going to be imminently killed by the most powerful army in the world. They couldn't live as slaves. It was impossible. So that's New England. Moving down to the mid-Atlantic, these are people who were organized aristocratically. The structure of their political societies was aristocratic in substance. And they were, but interestingly, they admired New England Republicanism. And this is something I found that really surprised me that historians don't talk about. That, for example, a letter from Patrick Henry to his friend John Adams, when he's requesting that Adams send him thoughts on government, that he could spread it around to the Southern statesmen so that they could learn about Republican government too, he says this: "We are about to form our first state convention to frame a constitution for the state of Virginia. Please advise us so that when we do form that constitution and a stranger walks into Virginia, that they will see a kindred relation between Virginia and Massachusetts." That is from Patrick Henry, the guy who said, "Give me liberty or give me death." He's trying to remake Virginia into the image of New England. And when Jefferson writes the Declaration of Independence, you know what John Adams' first response is? He says, "Yeah, no big deal. That looks just like a pamphlet that James Otis and Sam Adams wrote a few years back." It was old hat to him. It was not new. Okay? So these political, so really, the source of American republicanism is New England. The real revolution takes place in Virginia and the Mid-Atlantic, because these are people who are born into aristocratic society, but want to remake it into a Republican society, like their brethren up north. So they're these people, the Jeffersons, the George Masons, the Patrick Henrys, the James Madisons, the James Monroes, the John Marshalls, all these great Virginia statesmen, and including some from North Carolina, a majority of those in North Carolina, including John Iredell, who I quoted to you at the beginning. They were the same in this respect, and Maryland too. They wanted to, so they were like the Marquis de Lafayette or the Lamats in France during the French Revolution. These were born aristocrats who were sympathetic to the Republican cause, or the Abbé de Sieyès, who wanted to make France more Republican, into a republic. Okay? And their alliance with the New Englanders during the founding period was essential. They were the ones who helped make, and whose aid was indispensable to helping to make New England Republicanism become American Republicanism. The idea that, as Jefferson would say, the lex majoris partis, the first law of civil society, is that in which all people are equal of any human assembly, is that the majority should rule. The moral basis for majority rule is natural right, and Jefferson quotes Pufendorf on this. And the moral foundation is natural right, but natural right also limits what the majority can do, and this is what separates American republicanism from ancient republicanism, is that there are some things that the majority can't do. It cannot attack the rights of the minor party, the ones who lose an election, because if they did that, if the majority did that, it would attack its own moral basis for majority rule, which is natural right. So, natural right, this is the great American innovation that the Virginians especially help to make into American republicanism. Jefferson, when he writes the Declaration, this becomes a cornerstone of American republicanism that is that is worked out in the Constitution. Right? So the two are in harmony. The first principles of the natural rights republic are in the Declaration of Independence. The institutions that are going to preserve it and keep it going are in the Constitution. And if that machinery could, if anyone tries to bend that machinery to another purpose, towards monarchy or aristocracy, Article 4, Section 4 can be pulled out and the national government can go in and fix it. And they are within their constitutional bounds to do so. Right, so all states have the right and should exercise the right to govern themselves as they wish. As long as they're not trying to exercise power specifically enumerated to the federal government in Article 1, Section 8. As long as they are Republican in form. If they try to change, then national government can step in by right. Let's talk about South Carolina and Georgia. Very strange place. Some of you may have read and remember from Federalist number 2, John Jay says how it talks out the similarities of the different sections of America. And it's true, there were some important similarities there, but the idea of a union where there was greater uniformity was an aspirational idea. It was not achieved. South Carolina and Georgia are a case in point. South Carolina was the first of the two colonies to really grow. It was settled by planters from the British West Indies. Government was very different there. The British West Indies were the richest British colony, and especially Barbados, the richest British colony in North America. There were mainly sugar plantations, and they went to Africa and took slaves. Most of those islands were about half enslaved populations. Under their laws, anybody who was black was deemed a slave. Anybody who was slave was deemed property. The white majority that made up the roughly other half of the population on that island was dirt poor. and they had no influence in government. Only a tiny fraction of the population were the rulers, and they were very wealthy. Those are the people who settled South Carolina. South Carolina duplicated the government and way of life in the West Indies, starting in the late 1600s. About half of all slaves imported into North America from 1700 until the American Revolution went through Charleston, South Carolina. More than half of the population in the lowlands of South Carolina were slave populations. And then some South Carolina planters crossed the river and settled Georgia. Georgia began as the only state that did not permit slavery, but they just ignored the Board of Trustees rule, and then finally the Board of Trustees relented, and slavery began filling up Georgia. This is why, okay, so those are the three sections. They were, and their government, system of government, and way of oligarchic from the get-go. They were pro-slavery from the beginning, whereas north of South Carolina, in the mid-Atlantic colonies, their societies were structured in aristocratic fashion way as well, but they wanted to reform it. So they wanted to stamp out slavery, and they wanted to plant true republicanism. In South Carolina, that was not the case. They wanted to keep their current system going, and the reason why they joined the American, the reason why they remained part of the American Union was for reasons of interest, and not really because of principle. Right? So they became the sort of problem in the early republic, and the job was, from the get-go, was how are we going, so now you've got, oh, and by the way, if you want to see a really interesting contrast of New England and South Carolina, we have a first-hand account from Josiah Quincy, who was a member of the Boston Committee of Correspondence. The committees of correspondence were set up in each of the colonies when tensions with the mother country began before the War of Independence. They set them up and were communicating with each other. Each committee in each of the colonies, the committees of correspondence, to decide, what are we going to do? Josiah Quincy took a ship, went down to South Carolina to talk to South Carolina statesmen to figure out what are we going to do. And while he's there, he writes his diary. And it's a hoot, because he can't believe what he sees down there. And to him, he just thinks that they're barbarians. He talks about how anybody could just kill a slave for any reason. They lose a temper, kill a slave, and there's no punishment. The judge might give him a slap on the wrist. There are a whole bunch of things that he notices about how this society is just wildly different from their own up in New England. So that's what you got to make a union out of. Here's what Benjamin Rush said around this time. There is nothing more common than to confound the terms American Revolution with those of the late American War. The American War is over, but this is far from being the case with the American Revolution. On the contrary, nothing but the first act of the great drama is closed. It remains yet to establish and perfect our new forms of government and to prepare the principles, morals, and manners of our citizens for these forms of government after they are established and brought to perfection. This is Benjamin Rush, a very important founder, who is saying it's going to take some time. You see this also in Adams and Madison's writings when they're looking ahead prospectively. The goal is uniformity. Uniformity of what? Uniformity of Republican principle across the whole area. And the mid-Atlantic statesmen are doing this. They're reforming their own states. One historian who's very useful in the mid-1800s refers to the first Republican legislature of Virginia after independence in 1776. He calls, and Jefferson's worked there with his friends to write all these statutes that try to transform Virginia. He calls this process of transformation Jefferson's effort to Yankify Virginia. To Yankify Virginia. In other words, here he is actually trying to make Virginia into New England, something place more like New England. He's creating, ending primogeniture and entail, putting an education system in place, doing all these things. New Englanders didn't need an education. They already had an education. Everybody could read and write. And so they're trying to copy these institutions, and they had a ways to go. Here's why slavery was the great impediment. This room is already divided into three. Let's stick with this. Let's call this room the state of South Carolina. Let's say that everybody on this side of the room, you're all free. Yes. Okay? You are 3 legislative districts in the state of South Carolina. You're free. All of you are enslaved. What is your name, sir, with a Yankee?
Jack.
Jack. Yeah. By the way, God bless you for wearing the Yankee jacket. I'm from Jersey, so
okay.
I do not permit.
We knew you were a Yankee from the talk.
You did. Yes, that's right. Well, I am in every respect. Okay, so Jack, you're a slaveholder, everybody else slave. Professor Yenner, you are a slaveholder, everybody else is enslaved. You are each a legislative district in the state of South Carolina. Now think about this. You all have an election. What is your name, Miss? Ashley. Ashley, they elect you. You come to the Columbia in the South Carolina legislature. Jack, you come. Professor Yenner, you come. You two are slaveholders. These are all your slaves. You're free, and these are all your fellow citizens. What happens if you want to put any bill, let's say an education bill. You want to build schools. And oh, by the way, you're not even going to trouble them to ask for their tax money. You just want permission from the state government so that you can pool your money and build a schoolhouse because you got kids you want to get educated, you don't have schools. You come to the state legislature. You guys don't like that. Why? Because you have control of the state government. You're 2, she's 1. You can outvote her every time. You have the same number of people, human beings in each district, but they're dominated by slaves, they're dominated by slaves, but you got to count them when you apportion legislative districts, you're all free. They vote you down. They say, no, you can't build your own schools. If you want to, you can, if you want to get a little education, you can go to pauper schools, which is kind of like saying, go get some welfare. It makes you mad. You say, why are they doing this? We know what their source of their political power is. They're slaves. So then you start speaking out against slavery, and guess what they do? They pass a law that says anybody who criticizes slavery here will be put to death. And they actually do that. Okay? If you're caught with abolitionist literature, that's a capital offense. You getting the picture now? That's where their power came from. Slavery. It was not only a source of wealth for a very tiny percentage of the owners who owned all the slaves, most of the slaves. It was also a source of their political power. And you can see how in a system like this, it would of course be ruled by a few who owned the slaves. And guess what? All of you, steadily, they take away your American liberty, your birthright. They forbid freedom of assembly. They forbid freedom of speech. They forbid you even the right to tax yourselves to build your own schools. They can do anything that they want with you because they have power. They will strike you down and kill you if you don't obey a conscription order and come and fight for the Confederate Army that is fighting for their right to control this society. And they do. So guess what a lot of you folks do? You go sign up for the Union Army. There were poor white regiments from every state that formed the Confederacy, except for South Carolina. And Georgia, there was a battalion. South Carolina, Jeff Davis sent an army down there to the Spartanburg, Greenville area, which is where the non-slave holding whites were concentrated in that part of South Carolina so that they would not rise up. And they couldn't. Right? I think they sent Robert E. Lee's nephew, I can't recall if that's exactly right, but I think that's what happened at the beginning of the war. But there was an Alabama regiment that fought for the Union Army. There was a Mississippi regiment that fought, and it stands to reason. Because you have been suffering under an oligarchy all this time. What happened to the guarantee clause? It says that the United States government shall guarantee to every state a Republican form of government. You can't call this Republican government according to what the founders meant. It means rule by the majority based upon natural right. You are a ruled class. You have the right to vote, but it's meaningless because they can outvote you because of the way the legislative districts are. Oh, and by the way, they don't need your work, thank you very much. So you can't get any wages. Why? Because they own all the labor. They're getting richer off of this labor. Anybody who happens to have capital and they reinvest it in more labor that they purchase, it's like building a money-making machine that doesn't employ you. So what happens when new land comes available, new real estate comes available? They bid up the price. You can't afford it. You don't even, because you're poorer as a result of slavery because you don't have any wages. And also, they're bidding up the price amongst themselves. There's no way. So what do you live on? You live hard scrap. If you want to preserve your freedom from these people, you get as far into the uplands, the swamps and the byways, as James Garfield said, where freedom forever loves to dwell. That's where you go. And the only way that you can preserve your American birthright is to get away from them. And when war comes, many of you fight for the other side. That's what our American Civil War was about. How did we get there? Because they didn't enforce the Guarantee Clause. All of those mid-Atlantic statesmen at the founding period who were trying to reform their states in a Republican direction, it stopped after around 1820, 1830. They were busily reforming their states, and then it stops. Why does it stop? Because they changed. In one of the most important anti-slavery philippics any American can read, and every school child should read, it's by a guy by the name of George Mason. It was an address he wrote to the House of Burgess before the war. And in it, it's a magnificent work. And in it he says, if we do not end slavery, we will fail to secure a Republican government in the United States as we want. And he says, our children will be the future legislators, and if we do not end slavery, God is going to punish us through our children and grandchildren who will be raised in this infernal school called slavery, being masters. They will become unfitted to Republican equality and will expect to rule over all. And we will lose our Republican dream through our children, and this is how Providence will punish us. 80 years later, on the floor of the United States Senate, Senator James Doolittle from Wisconsin is saying to the Southerners, you don't stand where your father stood, where your own father stood. They used to be against slavery. They used to work with us to try to eliminate it so that we could build a pure republic, and you stopped taking measures that would doom slavery. You changed. And guess who steps to the lectern after Doolittle? A guy by the name of James Mason from Virginia, this guy's grandson. And he does, indeed, repudiate his grandfather's position. Not explicitly. He doesn't even remember that his grandfather prophesies exactly what he says at that lectern that day. He says, yes, you're right. We have changed our ground. Slavery is a blessing, not a curse. Our fathers and grandfathers were wrong. And now we're here because we know that slavery is a blessing to both master and slave. He stood on that floor and fulfilled his own grandfather's prophecy without even knowing it. Much in the same way that Peter repudiates Jesus 3 times without even knowing it. Even though Jesus predicted that he would, to Peter, that he would repudiate him. And that is exactly what James Mason did on the floor that day. It's a remarkable, dramatic scene, as so many are from this period of our history. They could not activate the guarantee clause because these grandsons of the Southern founders were now a part of the government. So while the Southern states were self-reforming, they deemed it unnecessary to use the power that the guarantee clause permits, constitutionally authorizes, to reform them, because they were reforming themselves. But later, when the statesmen change, and this is totally unpredicted, and start following Calhoun, and start praising oligarchy and slavery, they're already part of the federal government. And there is no way that they can use the power granted under the Article 4, Section 4. And that's why, after the American Civil War, we get the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment specifies what Republican government is, at least with respect to citizenship. In my view, according to a proper theory of the Constitution, it was unnecessary. Because the meaning of the word Republican had been disputed in that period leading up to the American Civil War, they needed to specify exactly, they needed to fix that definition in a constitutional amendment so it could not be disputed again. And that's why the 14th Amendment says, it eliminates differentiation amongst citizenship. Well, I'm told that I'm supposed to wrap it up now, and I guess I will. But I'm ready to field questions for as long as you'd like. Thank you.
So Professor Nabors will just do the questions himself now. No one complimented me about the plaid jacket that I. But anyways, that's all right.
Well,
so he's just going to handle you guys himself.
He's just making me feel at home.
Yeah. So please pose any questions for him. We'll take him for about 20 minutes or so.
Sure. Yes, in the back. Hello again.
Hey. So yeah, I guess you kind of answered my question. Is how come the national government didn't exercise
before the
and why they do Civil War instead of just exercising the power that they did have and just go into the South and change from oligarchy to republic?
Right. Well, this new generation, of Southern statesmen who really began to assert themselves in the 1830s beyond, who are principled oligarchs, they start fiddling with the meaning of the word Republican. And they say, they're saying, oh yeah, well, they abandon the founders' definition, and they start using, ancient Rome and all these ancient types, which Madison and the founders explicitly say their Republican regimes were defective. The American regime was supposed to fix them. So that is how they sort of forensically did combat with Northerners who were saying, you can see it in the Missouri debates and through the nullification conference, they were saying that slavery and Republican form of government are incompatible. They're incompatible. And I just demonstrated to you in one simple way why slavery causes Republican government to degenerate. It doesn't matter what your Constitution says. It doesn't matter how much your Constitution praises Republicanism. The result of having lots of slaves when you apportion legislative districts is what I just showed you. And but this new generation of Southern statesmen would say, we are Republicans. We believe in Republican. We're proud of it. And it was hokum. Their version of what Republican government was had nothing to do with, and was with Jefferson, Madison, Adams, etc. There was another hint. Yes, Austin.
If most of the New Englanders' convictions about natural right came from their religious convictions,
yeah,
what was the extent of John Locke's influence on the founders?
They liked them. They liked Algernon Sidney. They liked Harrington. But they liked their own, too. They liked John Adams. The way to look at, the effect of the Reformation through early modernity is that, it was especially strong in northern Germany and Scandinavia and parts of England. And the Huguenots got crushed. They were another, and Holland. Those were the places. And it's interesting that the most successful experiments with republicanism, the most successful modern republic before the American was the Dutch one. But these ideas are, they grow out of this sort of Protestant milieu at the same time. And these systems of government that grow that are similar also grow up in heavily Protestant areas of Europe and North America. And the Pilgrims were of the right sect, the right denomination. They were Congregationalists. Right? Now, I'm Catholic, so I'm not saying this just to praise congregation, because I'm a Congregationalist, because I'm not. But there was something wonderful about their version, their denomination, and that kind of Protestant thinking that reinforced self-government. And so it's not surprising that the most successful experiment with Republican government prior to the American example was in Holland, and that they were also very Protestant there. So, when you look at the highest levels of education around that same time as well, same places. Why? Well, because we got to get those little rugrats to read the Bible. And that leads to other things, like the ability to read, to be educated, to govern yourself, to be an intelligent citizen. But what made America the conditions were uniquely propitious there was because they had a clear field to really develop this. Scandinavia, Sweden was at war with Russia. There were always other powers right close by who didn't want to see this stuff develop. But in America, in New England, it had a free chance to really develop and become stronger, and it did. It did. And it spread from there. And it actually did. All the states carved out in the Northwest, or Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, parts of Minnesota, all cloned in the model of New England. Okay? And they're the ones who won the Civil War. They're the ones, all of those, so you clone New England and move them up. All those troops who met the British at Concord, their clones were in Sherman's Army of the West that won the Civil War and was gathered from those states. Yes, sir.
So I just have a question. We're talking a lot about New England being the home of the true American republicanism.
Yes.
And you were talking about that the true American republicanism is based on the respect of natural rights.
Yes.
So then when you have southern states that were arguing that they had natural rights to own slaves,
right, versus
the North's argument that there was a natural right to freedom of men.
Yes.
Then at what point, I guess I'm asking, can you enumerate what certain natural rights were that was just purely wrong for the South that the North had right? Or is Republicanism subjective in that sense where if you can make a good enough argument for a natural right, that becomes a
Yeah, I'm not sure if you want a theoretical answer or a historical one. I can give you I can give you both. The historical answer is that none of them really believed that anyone had a natural right to own a slave. In fact, a slaveholder, Thomas Jefferson, said that slavery was a flagrant abuse of natural right. That's his language, flagrant abuse. Madison said at the Constitutional Convention that they needed to keep the word slavery out. His reasoning was that when slavery was abolished in the country, which he expected it would be, and it needed to be, he did not want the word slave to mar the Constitution. He wanted the Constitution to be read by future generations after the abolition of slavery as if it had never even existed. He said this is a quote, "It is wrong to admit the idea that it is right for man to hold property in man in the Constitution." Okay. So historically, there was no disagreement about what were natural rights. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, natural right to property. That's pretty much, in general, covers it. That's the New England idea. That's the Lockean idea. These are cousin, the intellectual development of New England concept of natural rights and the Lockean one. These are sort of these are branches descending from the same source. So they're cousin ideas that then get re-rolled back into America through review. Briefly, the theoretical answer, and I'll come to you. The theoretical answer to your question is that to me, it is absurd to suggest that any human being has a natural right to own another. That is basically claiming the position of natural inequality. If anybody has a natural right to own property in another, then what you're saying is that human beings are actually naturally differentiated into better or worse, and some by nature have a rightful claim over another human being. And I don't think that's correct. I think human beings are naturally equal. We are all part of the same human family, and we're all obliged by our Creator to recognize, this is what it means by self-evident truth, we're all morally obliged to recognize that each of us are equal in the possession of an equal quanta of natural rights. So, to be fully human means to recognize this essential fact that we are one human family. And we're made this way. Now, we can treat dog despotically because we are superior to dog. God may treat us despotically because he is superior to us. But none of us may treat another human being despotically because none of us are by nature superior to any other. And so that's the theoretical answer. And this was not disputed during the founding period. The South Carolinas, Georgias were relatively quiet at that time. Now, they would clamor for policy victories, but they never advanced their principles so boldly as later generations did. I always make a distinction between the American founders south of North Carolina, in South Carolina, Georgia, from all the rest, because it was a different kettle of fish down there. Yes, miss?
So I was wondering about your opinion on the Dred Scott decision, because I remember reading that the judge's decision was that the founding fathers, in short term, accepted slavery. And I'm gathering from what you're saying, and my understanding of it is that you're saying that they did not approve of slavery.
Yes, a majority of the American founders, at least a majority, north of South Carolina did not approve of slavery, even though many of them were slaveholders themselves. They did not. And the record is overwhelming about what they say. Now, one could argue and say, well, they were just hypocrites. Why? Why were they hypocrites? Well, because they continue to keep slaves. Okay, well, remember, and Americans, I don't want to be too harsh in criticizing Americans who take that position, because it's so hard to understand the predicament that they were in. Let's say you were a slave owner, you had 100 slaves. And I'm going to assume you don't like slavery. You were born into that position. What do you do? As an American today, what would be your instinct to do what with them? Yeah, you'd want to.
Or just
Okay.
pay them to do the work.
Okay, that sounds pretty good. Let's say you free them. Let's say you're in South Carolina. What could happen to them?
They could possibly be killed because of my decision. Or I could be killed.
Yeah, you gotta worry about resistance and all of that, but what is a less dramatic but equal, very, very plausible outcome for them?
They would probably just go back into slavery.
But how? Kidnapping.
Slave
Yeah, you're releasing them into a hostile world. Where are they gonna go? Oh, and by the way, when they were torn from their native land, their ancestors, they don't really know the language anymore. They're not Africans anymore. And neither are they really recognized as American citizens. They're slaves. So if you let them go, you're letting them into a hostile world where they're always going to be marked. Somebody else could grab them, throw them into slavery. Where do they go? This is hard. Yeah, north, maybe. But guess what? On the moment after the Declaration of Independence was promulgated into the United States, announcing that America's independent, every single one of the states was a slave state because Britain forbade the colonies to abolish the importation of slaves or the abolition of slavery. So every single one was. It's not an easy question. I've thought this through, spent years trying to think through, okay, what were their options? Why didn't they take those options? And it's hard. It requires statesmanship to figure out this path to an all-Republican future when there are no slaves on anybody's plantation. Now, to use the modern phrase, if you don't mind, you could virtue signal and release them into a hostile world, and something really bad could happen to them. But you have done the kind and right thing by releasing them so that your hands are not dirty with slavery. Great. And now all these people are running for their lives. What can you do? This is a problem. And they work out a lot of plans to free them, to thin out slaveholding, to ease manumission. They do a lot of things in the founding period. Not only they don't just speak out against it, they also pass a lot of legislation to stop the increase and to facilitate ultimate abolition. Yes, sir?
It would seem to me to be implicit in your approach, or at least the argument could be made using it, that slavery and therefore the Civil War were possible because the South was insufficiently Christian compared to England. Now, I don't know about you, but in my family, it's generally presumed that people in the South are the ones who are the more Christian, and the people in the North would have a tendency to be overwhelmingly secularist. If somebody were to use something like the position that you're using to make that claim, how would you respond?
So you're talking about today, and it's probably true that today, that the American South does tend to be more church-going. If you do surveys, I cannot recall. I do look at Pew Forum research on religiosity in the United States. I can't remember the exact figures, but when it comes to attendance twice a month or more, they're probably doing, they probably are a lot at much higher rates than they are in New England today. That's true. That's today. Back then, I'm not saying that they were more Christian. I am saying that their version of Christianity was different, and that their version of Christianity is very useful to the establishment of Republican government. And that in a way that other denominations of Christianity just weren't. I mean, these people, they fled England, they came to Holland, and then they came to the United States, to colonial America, because they wanted to practice their religion and their way of life, which was structured by that religion. And so I don't mean to say that they were more religious, but they were probably their religion was just very friendly to the kind of government that today we honor. Other questions? Yes, sir.
We'll make this the last question.
Okay, the last one.
Unless someone has a really good one.
Yeah, I don't take away from anybody's very good question. I suppose that in that case, within your life works and studies, what would be your largest priority for future generations in terms of restructuring or a means of priority of focus?
You mean for what should we be worried about today with respect to preserving Republican form of government?
What is greatest virtue?
What is the greatest virtue of Republican government? Oh, well.
Greatest virtue for humanity.
Well, okay.
You have 3 minutes.
Well, I think I can answer that in 3 minutes. So, actually, I have spent a good portion of my life studying this system of government and reading the works of those who established it. And I must say, I do believe that the idea that they had in mind, their model, is the best that we've got, that humanity has. It includes the protection of human beings, the equal protection of all human beings, of all citizens, with respect to their natural rights. And it also includes the equal protection of the unequal faculties of acquisition, as well as the equal protection of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Now that, to me, is a recipe for protecting, for natural justice, for really securing what Aristotle doesn't believe any regime in human history has ever achieved or ever can achieve. The Americans believe they have worked it out. And I think human beings thrive and are happiest in this kind of government when it has a free chance to develop and is kept in that form. And it did for a long time. From the founding period, it sweeps in all the free states, and I think through the 1800s, and Americans are incredibly successful in this. Their system of republicanism is very, very successful, and I think human beings are the happiest then. They can pursue their dreams in any which way they want, and nobody can ever say you didn't build that. And Horace Mann puts it best: in a Republican form of government, every man can be a king. And meet each other on an equal plane like that. So, but I think we've, in our times, we have, in the last 100 years, some Americans have believed that we need a new form of government, a new way of life, and they've tried to put that into place. Americans have not taken to that idea all that well, and so the verdict is still out. We're in the middle of what I would say is a revolution right now. It's not a bloody one. Not all revolutions are bloody, but it is political. It's being fought out, and we don't know yet if we are going to restore the model of government that the founders had in mind, or we're going to put something else more firmly in place. We don't know who will win, but you know which side I'm on.
Thank you guys all for coming out. out. I guess we have a sign-up sheet back there, if people that need to sign up, but Forrest is also here to sign books for those who have them. Otherwise, be safe and, don't do drugs.
You kept recording.
Okay, good, yeah. How do I stop it?